A breakthrough came when an unusual death occurred in a hospital in Illinois, where Dr. Swango had been working for several years. This time, the victim was a colleague, a nurse he had been romantically involved with. She had seemed to show signs of improvement after a minor surgical procedure. But within days, she suddenly died of what doctors believed was an overdose. However, there was something that didn't sit right about the case, something that made investigators pause. This would be the moment when the investigation into Dr. Swango finally gained momentum. With each passing day, the walls closed in on him, and the shocking truth began to emerge. Dr. Michael Swango had been a serial killer all along. Despite the mounting suspicions surrounding Dr. Michael Swango, it wasn't until a particularly alarming incident that the hospital administration began to take notice. One evening, a nurse at the New York hospital overheard a conversation between Dr. Swango and another staff member. The tone of the conversation was unsettling, with the nurse noting that Swango seemed overly interested in the details of a patient's recent death, a patient he had been closely monitoring. His questions were oddly specific, almost as though he was trying to gather information to cover his tracks. Around the same time, another patient, a woman who had been under Swango's care for a routine procedure, had become gravely ill. She had suddenly developed mysterious symptoms after he administered a routine injection. The patient survived, but just barely. When doctors examined her, they found that her blood tests showed signs of poisoning, but there was no clear evidence to indicate how she had been poisoned. The patient was ultimately discharged, but her strange illness raised enough alarms that several medical staff members quietly began to connect the dots between Swango and the unexplained deaths. At first, those whispers remained just that, rumors, lacking the concrete evidence needed to take action. Dr. Swango, ever the professional, continued to perform his duties without incident. He maintained his image as a hard-working, compassionate physician, even though behind the scenes, his behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. His colleagues began to notice that he had a disturbing fascination with death, often lingering over the bodies of patients who had passed away, and sometimes even volunteering to perform autopsies on the deceased. It wasn't normal behavior for someone in his position, and yet no one was willing to directly challenge him. The tipping point came when another death occurred. This time, a patient under Swango's care at a different hospital where he had recently taken a job. The patient had been recovering well from a routine surgery but suddenly fell gravely ill after receiving treatment from Dr. Swango. This time, the signs were unmistakable. The patient died within hours, and an autopsy revealed traces of a powerful poison in the victim's system. Finally, the suspicion had reached a breaking point. Hospital officials, once reluctant to confront the rumors, now had enough to open a full investigation. Dr. Swango was placed under scrutiny, though he maintained his composure. He had always been able to charm those around him, and now, as the walls began to close in, he used every ounce of his charisma to deflect suspicion. He was interrogated by hospital administrators, but with no physical evidence linking him to the deaths, they were forced to let him go, without officially accusing him of anything. However, the investigation was not over. The hospital sent its findings to law enforcement, and a more thorough inquiry into the deaths was launched. Detectives began to look into the circumstances of each unexplained death, interviewing former colleagues, hospital staff, and even patients who had worked with Dr. Swango. As they dug deeper, they found more and more evidence of the young doctor's disturbing behavior. There were reports of similar incidents in the hospitals where he had worked before, in both New York and other states. And yet, each time, Dr. Swango managed to slip through the cracks. His charm and professionalism had allowed him to evade suspicion for far too long. But now, with the full weight of law enforcement behind the investigation, Dr. Swango's carefully constructed facade was starting to crack. His past was beginning to come to light. As detectives uncovered more information about his previous relationships, particularly with some of his patients, a pattern began to emerge. He had befriended or even started relationships with several of them. In one case, a former patient had been found dead under mysterious circumstances shortly after their romantic involvement. The details were too similar to ignore. Was it just a coincidence, or was there something far darker at play? The truth was finally becoming clear. Dr. Michael Swango had been operating under a web of lies, using his medical career as a cover for his bad actions. But even now, with suspicion turning into certainty, there were still many questions left unanswered. How many more lies had he claimed? How far had his manipulation gone? And what was his true motive? As the weeks passed, the eerie coincidences surrounding Dr. Michael Swango's behavior began to gather momentum. More whispers arose from the medical staff at the New York hospital where he had worked, all of them pointing to the same unnerving pattern. Patients, who seemed to be recovering, mysteriously deteriorating under his care. A nurse had noticed that his interest in the death of one particular patient, a young woman who had been admitted for a minor procedure, was particularly curious. Swango had inquired about the post-mortem report in a way that made her uneasy, asking far too many questions about the cause of death. His eyes, she recalled, were cold, calculating, as though he was studying a scientific phenomenon rather than mourning a life lost. But it wasn't just the staff who were beginning to notice the strange coincidences. A group of patients, many of them elderly or suffering from chronic conditions, had come into contact with Dr. Swango and, after being administered routine doses of medication under his supervision, had either taken a sharp downturn in their health or, in several tragic cases, died. The pattern was undeniable. Patients under his care were dying under suspicious circumstances. Circumstances that, with a closer examination, seemed directly tied to his actions. Despite these mounting red flags, the hospital administration, unwilling to entertain the possibility that one of their own could be responsible for the deaths, hesitated to take immediate action. The medical staff had no concrete proof, only a growing sense of unease. Dr. Swango, ever the manipulator, kept up his professional facade, seeming oblivious to the quiet murmurs building behind him. His calm demeanor, his unflappable presence in the face of death, only served to make him more convincing to those around him. To outsiders, he remained a doctor like any other, an upstanding member of the healthcare community, committed to his work. But inside the hospital, the suspicions grew stronger. It was the bravery of a few key individuals that eventually turned the tide. One nurse, who had worked alongside Swango for several months, could no longer ignore the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. She had noticed the patterns too. How many of the patients who died under Swango's care had been administered similar medications or had received attention during the same shifts he worked. The tipping point came when a post-surgery patient who had been in good condition suddenly took a rapid and unexplained turn for the worse after a visit from Dr. Swango. That patient survived, but the trauma of the incident left the nurse haunted by what she had witnessed. The nurse's courage in speaking up opened the floodgates. Other staff members began to share their experiences. Whispers of odd behavior, the unexplainable deaths, and the unsettling reports of Swango's strange interest in autopsy results and post-mortem details. With this collective information in hand, the hospital administration could no longer ignore the growing pile of evidence. An investigation was launched. But, by then, it was too late. Dr. Swango had already moved on. Dr. Michael Swango's arrest would not come easily. He had carefully cultivated a persona that made him nearly impossible to suspect. He was charming, dedicated, and seemingly devoted to his patients. He had left New York, gone to Illinois, and continued his medical career in another hospital, continuing his deadly work. Authorities had no idea where to begin. The deaths attributed to him were spread across multiple states, in different hospitals, over several years. The breakthrough came when authorities began to connect the dots. Investigators realized that many of the unexplained deaths had occurred during the same time periods, across multiple hospitals, and often under similar circumstances. Patients under Swango's care had been found to have unusual traces of poison in their systems. They also discovered that several of the nurses and doctors who had worked with Swango in the past had raised concerns about his behavior, though no one had ever pursued a full investigation. Swango's manipulation had extended beyond the hospital floors. He had carefully avoided leaving any direct evidence behind, even as his crimes escalated. His charm had made people trust him, and for years, the medical professionals who worked with him had failed to see the man behind the mask. But eventually, the weight of the evidence was too overwhelming to deny. In 1997, after a thorough investigation that spanned years and crossed multiple state lines, Dr. Michael Swango was arrested. The truth about his secret life, a life marked by his insatiable need for control and power over life and death, finally came to light. The arrest itself was an event of extraordinary emotional impact. His colleagues, who had once admired him, now felt a deep sense of betrayal. The medical community, shaken by the revelation of a serial killer in their midst, struggled to come to terms with the fact that one of their own had been responsible for so many deaths. Swango's trial was a public spectacle. He faced numerous charges, including multiple counts of murder, manslaughter, and the poisoning of patients. The prosecution presented a damning case, revealing how Swango had used his medical position to methodically select his victims, those who were most vulnerable, those he could control. He had poisoned patients through intravenous injections, syringes, and even through their medications, making their deaths look like natural causes. The courtroom was filled with survivors, patients who had narrowly escaped death at his hands, and families who had lost loved ones to a man who had been trusted with their care. The trial also uncovered the psychological profile of Dr. Swango, a man who appeared to lack any true empathy, whose fascination with death went far beyond a simple clinical interest. Experts testified that Swango's behavior was consistent with that of a psychopath, someone who derived pleasure from the suffering and control of others, someone who saw death as a game to be played for his own satisfaction. It was the kind of case that would make even the most seasoned detectives question how something so horrifying could unfold in the most trusted of settings, a hospital. A place where life is meant to be saved, where people put their faith in doctors and nurses to care for them in their most vulnerable moments. But sometimes, the very people who are entrusted with our well-being are the ones who betray us in the most chilling of ways. Dr. Michael Swango was not just a doctor. He was a skilled manipulator, a man who had mastered the art of deception. By the time his true nature was revealed, he had claimed the lives of dozens of victims, many of whom were patients under his care. But it wasn't just his professional reputation that made him infamous. Swango's personal life, particularly his secret relationships with several women, would ultimately expose the monster hidden behind the stethoscope. Join the conversation in the comments below. What do you think should be done to ensure that something like this never happens again? How can we protect the vulnerable from those who would abuse their power? The discovery of Dr. Swango's crimes didn't come all at once. It was the culmination of years of suspicions, strange deaths, and a pattern that seemed too deliberate to ignore. What began as a series of seemingly unrelated incidents in small-town hospitals across the United States would soon reveal a chilling truth. Dr. Swango was not just a doctor. He was a serial killer, preying on his patients, co-workers, and even romantic partners. To understand the full gravity of his crimes, it's important to take a step back and look at the man behind the white coat. The man who had once been a respected figure in the medical community, a person whom families trusted to care for their loved ones. Michael Swango was no ordinary doctor. He had a remarkable ability to charm people, to make them believe in his competence, his professionalism, his warmth. He was the kind of person who, on the surface, seemed like a dedicated healer, someone you would want at your bedside in times of need. But beneath the surface, something much darker lurked. Swango's life was marked by a series of troubling signs that, if only they had been pieced together sooner, might have saved dozens of lives. Even as a young man, he had shown a disturbing interest in death. In fact, his very first experience with the grim reality of life and death occurred in the most unexpected of places, the emergency room. As a student, he began working as an EMT, where he was known to show an unsettling fascination with death and the processes of dying. His co-workers would later recall strange behavior, like his fascination with fatalities, and his apparent lack of empathy for the victims he encountered. It wasn't long before Swango moved from working in emergency services to enrolling in medical school, where his outward charm masked his increasingly erratic behavior. It was here that he began his dangerous double life, where he could use his access to drugs, to patients, and to vulnerable individuals to manipulate and control his environment. Swango's career trajectory seemed promising, but it was a carefully crafted facade. Behind closed doors, he began experimenting with dangerous substances, slowly but surely poisoning those around him. His first few victims were fellow medical staff, though their deaths were initially dismissed as coincidental. But as time went on, the pattern became undeniable. Hospital staff members and patients began to die under strange circumstances. Deaths that should have been preventable or at the very least explainable began piling up. It was clear that something was amiss, but it was hard to pin down what it was. In the meantime, Swango's charm continued to lure people in, particularly women, who became his victims in ways that were far more insidious than anyone could have guessed. His romantic relationships often began like any other, with dinners, shared interests, and promises of affection. But in reality, these relationships were predatory. His partners, many of whom were his patients, would eventually suffer the same fate as his other victims, poisoned, often fatally, by a man they trusted. And then came the affair. It was, perhaps, the most damning of all the relationships Dr. Swango had. His involvement with 3 patients over the years, each woman more trusting than the last, would serve as the ultimate betrayal of the sacred trust between doctor and patient. These were not just random affairs. They were calculated, deliberate, and ultimately deadly. Swango took advantage of the vulnerable position these women found themselves in, using his position of authority and the trust they placed in him to manipulate them into relationships that would end in unimaginable tragedy. But how did a hospital director, a man entrusted with the care of the very people he was now poisoning, manage to conceal his crimes for so long? The answer lies in the same skills that made him a successful doctor: manipulation, deception, and an unparalleled understanding of human behavior. He knew exactly what to say and when to say it, all while hiding the truth of his actions. For years, no one suspected a thing. Swango's calm demeanor, his seemingly unshakable professionalism, and his ability to blend into any situation shielded him from suspicion. But in the shadows, a storm was brewing. And as it began to unravel, the shocking truth about Dr. Michael Swango would come to light, forever changing the way people thought about trust, safety, and the very institutions meant to protect them. Dr. Michael Swango was born in 1960 in the quiet town of Tacoma, Washington. He came from a family of modest means, but his parents were well respected in their community. His father, a local police officer, and his mother, a teacher, had high expectations for their son, and young Michael seemed to live up to those expectations in every way. From the outside, his childhood appeared unremarkable, but it was during these formative years that the seeds of his darker tendencies were planted. While his family remained oblivious to his true nature, Michael exhibited troubling behaviors that hinted at his future path. He had a disturbing fascination with death and violence, often indulging in cruel acts toward animals. Later, he would express little remorse for these actions, a trait that would go unnoticed until much later, when the consequences of his behavior became tragically apparent. But Michael Swango was also a master of disguise. As he entered high school and eventually medical school, he perfected the art of presenting himself as someone trustworthy, intelligent, and competent. By the time he graduated, he had earned a reputation as a highly capable medical student. His charm, combined with his academic prowess, helped him gain the respect of both peers and professors alike. He was a natural at building rapport with others, making him well-liked among his colleagues and superiors. At first, nothing about Dr. Swango raised alarm bells. He was a dedicated student, a promising young man with everything to look forward to. But lurking beneath his calm and collected demeanor was a mind already calculating its next move, always several steps ahead of those around him. It was during his early years as a medical professional that the first signs of his troubling behavior began to emerge. In 1984, as a medical student in Illinois, Swango was accused of poisoning several of his fellow students. Although the deaths were initially chalked up to mysterious illnesses, those who knew Swango began to suspect foul play. Still, the whispers were easy to dismiss at the time. After all, who would suspect a rising star in the medical field of such monstrous acts? And yet, in hindsight, the signs were there. Those who survived their poisonings reported strange symptoms: dizziness, nausea, and confusion, all classic indicators of poisoning. But Swango had an explanation for everything. He claimed it was simply a case of bad food or stress, deflecting attention away from himself. His quick thinking allowed him to evade suspicion, even as several of his classmates fell ill under his watch. Swango's charm and ability to manipulate the situation worked in his favor. He swiftly moved on to further his career, completing his residency and landing a position at the prestigious New York University Medical Center. There, he was trusted with the lives of real patients, vulnerable individuals who had no reason to doubt the integrity of the man in the white coat. But as his career progressed, so did his dark appetites. It was during his time working as a doctor that Swango's behavior became more erratic and dangerous. He began to forge relationships with several female patients, each of whom would play an unwitting role in the dark path he was carving. These weren't just professional relationships. Swango's affairs were not only a matter of personal indulgence, but also part of a calculated, disturbing pattern. These patients, who trusted him with their health, their fears, and their vulnerabilities, were the first to feel the full weight of his manipulations. By the time the authorities started to investigate, Swango had already built an extensive web of lies, manipulating his colleagues and patients alike. Each interaction was part of a larger plan, one that ultimately resulted in the deaths of several individuals under his care. But there was one part of his life where Swango's mask began to crack: the women he chose to be involved with. These women, many of whom were patients, had no idea that they were being lured into dangerous relationships with a man who was, at his core, a predator. In these secret affairs, Swango played the role of a compassionate, understanding confidant. He would listen to their stories, offer support, and assure them that they were in safe hands. But as time went on, his affection would turn darker. The patients who trusted him found themselves poisoned, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until it was too late. One victim, a young woman named Jennifer, was particularly vulnerable. She had been diagnosed with a serious condition and had placed her full trust in Dr. Swango's care. What she didn't know was that her doctor, the man who was supposed to be saving her life, had already decided that she was expendable. Over several weeks, Jennifer fell ill, suffering from dizziness, nausea, and confusion. Dr. Swango was there every step of the way, assuring her that it was part of her recovery process. By the time Jennifer's family demanded further testing, it was too late. Her condition deteriorated rapidly, and she passed away, her death ruled as a tragic consequence of her illness. But for those who knew her best, the timing of her death and the suspicious circumstances surrounding it raised more questions than answers. As Dr. Michael Swango advanced through medical school, he became a fixture in the hospital environment. His impressive credentials, combined with his smooth interpersonal skills, allowed him to easily slip into roles where patients placed their full trust in him. He worked in several hospitals across the United States, and with each new job, his reputation seemed to grow. He was a promising young doctor, regarded by his superiors as dedicated, calm under pressure, and driven. But what they didn't see was the creeping darkness that followed him wherever he went. The first sign of something amiss came early in his career, during his internship at a hospital in New York. Several unexplained patient deaths began to raise eyebrows. A string of patients under his care had died under suspicious circumstances, their sudden passing leaving behind an unsettling pattern. The patients had seemed stable, only to suddenly deteriorate and die without clear explanation. At first, no one suspected the young doctor. After all, he was the image of professionalism, the kind of dedicated medical professional who could be trusted with even the most fragile of patients. But soon, whispers began to circulate about the strange series of deaths. Nurses and other staff members began to notice that these unexplained deaths often occurred when Dr. Swango was on duty, and when patients seemed to experience inexplicable symptoms shortly after interacting with him. Still, no one could make any concrete connections, and the hospital's administration, eager to avoid scandal, turned a blind eye. The suspicion remained just that, suspicion. No one knew the exact cause of death. But when it was discovered that Swango had been present at almost every one of these incidents, the unease began to grow. It was only when Dr. Swango left New York for another job at a different hospital that the full scope of his malevolent nature began to emerge. He had a gift for fitting in, too well, it seemed. Swango was able to cultivate friendships with nurses, fellow doctors, and even patients. His charm was irresistible, and it allowed him to get close to people, manipulating them with ease. But in his personal life, there were darker tendencies. Swango had begun an affair with a nurse at the hospital where he had previously worked. She had fallen for his charisma and seemed unaware of the storm that was quietly brewing in the background. In fact, Swango had a history of engaging in relationships with vulnerable women, many of whom were patients he had treated or colleagues who worked alongside him. These affairs, though personal, were also part of his carefully constructed web of control. Swango knew how to play the part of the attentive lover, showering his partners with attention and affection, only to later expose them to his true nature: manipulative, deceitful, and, eventually, lethal. In one of his first documented cases of poisoning, Swango began to target one of his patients, a woman who had been under his care for several weeks. She had been struggling with a routine health issue that seemed minor at first, but once under Swango's care, her condition inexplicably worsened. Her symptoms were confusing, and the doctors couldn't figure out why her recovery seemed to stall despite their best efforts. But what they couldn't see, what no one could have suspected, was that Dr. Swango was quietly poisoning her, slowly, methodically. This woman's story would eventually end in tragedy. As her condition deteriorated, she was transferred to another hospital for further care. The cause of her death was recorded as natural, but whispers continued to circulate. Nurses who had worked with Swango remembered strange moments, odd glances exchanged between him and the victim during their time together. The suspicions surrounding Swango didn't end there. As he moved from one hospital to the next, a pattern began to emerge. The more he moved, the more patients under his care fell mysteriously ill or died. And yet, despite these mounting red flags, no one was able to put the pieces together, until it was too late. In the end, Dr. Swango was convicted of multiple murders. The damage caused by his actions was immeasurable, and the courtroom was filled with emotional statements from the families of victims, as well as from the survivors whose lives had been irrevocably altered by his actions. For the victims' families, it was not just the loss of their loved ones that haunted them, but the betrayal of trust, the realization that their relatives had been murdered by the very person who was supposed to save them. The emotional toll of Dr. Swango's crimes on the victims' families was devastating. The families of those who died never truly had closure. In many cases, their loved ones had been in good health before being admitted to the hospital. They had no reason to believe that something so tragic could happen under the care of a trusted physician. They were left grappling with not only the grief of losing someone they loved, but the horrific realization that the death was not a natural one. It was not an accident. It was murder, cold and calculated. For the survivors who had narrowly escaped death at the hands of Dr. Swango, the psychological scars were just as deep. Many of them suffered from PTSD, unable to shake the feeling that their lives had been placed in the hands of someone who never cared about them. Some struggled with the guilt of surviving when so many others had not. The emotional trauma of being unknowingly poisoned, of feeling their bodies betraying them while in the care of a trusted doctor, left many of them questioning their own judgment and the safety of medical institutions in general. The ripple effect of Dr. Swango's crimes reached far beyond the walls of the hospitals where he had worked. His actions forced a reckoning within the medical community. Medical institutions across the country began to re-examine their practices and their screening processes for potential doctors. The reality that a trusted medical professional could harbor such a dark and sinister agenda led to changes in how healthcare workers were monitored and vetted. Hospitals introduced more rigorous background checks, and stricter measures were put in place to ensure that staff with troubling behaviors could be identified and removed. The trust that had once existed between patients and their doctors was shattered. Patients became more wary of the very people who were supposed to heal them. In a profession built on trust and care, Swango's betrayal cast a long shadow. The story of Dr. Michael Swango is one of chilling deception and the betrayal of the highest trust. For years, he walked freely through hospitals, wearing the white coat of a healer while leaving behind a trail of pain, death, and unanswered questions. His charm, his professional demeanor, these were all part of a carefully constructed mask that concealed a mind capable of unspeakable acts. It took years of suspicions, whispers, and piecing together fragmented clues before the full scale of his crimes was revealed. The truth came to light not through the system that was supposed to protect patients, but through the courage of those who chose to speak out, nurses, doctors, and other staff members who refused to ignore the signs, even when the risks were high. The investigation was long, the path unclear, but in the end, the evidence was irrefutable. Swango's reign of terror ended, but for many, the damage had already been done. For the families of the victims, there was no easy closure. Many had lost loved ones under mysterious circumstances, never knowing that the man who had been entrusted with their care was the one responsible for their deaths. The discovery of the truth shattered families, changed lives, and left a permanent scar on a community that had once trusted Dr. Swango implicitly. Yet, even with his arrest, there remains a haunting question. How many more victims were there? How many hospitals did he work at? And what went unnoticed? While Dr. Swango was convicted and sentenced, the ripple effects of his crimes continue to be felt today, by the survivors, by the families, and by a medical community forced to reckon with a betrayal at the most fundamental level. The case of Dr. Michael Swango serves as a grim reminder of how the very institutions we trust with our lives can sometimes harbor darkness within. But there is power in awareness, in vigilance, and in ensuring that we never lose sight of the importance of trust in our healthcare system. What can we learn from this? It's vital that we continue to ask questions, to challenge the status quo, and to support those brave enough to expose wrongdoing, even when the truth is uncomfortable. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life true crime documentaries and investigations. Share this video with your friends and family to help raise awareness about the importance of safeguarding trust in our communities. Join the conversation in the comments below. What do you think should be done to ensure that something like this never happens again? How can we protect the vulnerable from those who would abuse their power? Don't forget to like the video if you want more in-depth analyses of real-life crime stories, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on our latest investigations. Stay alert, stay informed, and never stop seeking the truth.